Well, the National Treasury has estimated that the salary agreement between government and trade unions will come at an additional cost of 37.4 billion rand to the public purse over the course of the 2023-2024 financial period. This follows a two-year wage agreement between the government and trade unions, which came into effect on the 1st of April. Now, Treasury warns that this additional amount will come at a cost of future jobs. Labour lawyer and Chamber of Commerce trustee Michael Bagraim says had anticipated that as South Africa gets nearer to the election year of 2024, the government will give in to trade unions' demands, which will lead to a collapse of the public purse and the state. Labour consultant Tony Healy joins us now to take this conversation further. Tony, thanks for your time. Thanks for talking to us this morning.
Good morning, Leanne.
So let's start off by getting your views on the National Treasury's warning that this revision is to cost about 37.4 billion rand over the course of the 2023-2024 financial period.
Well, yes, it's again, what we're seeing is a continuation of government systematically paying above inflation increases. And therein, I think, lies the problem. If you look at the 7.5% in the current deal, versus in the private sector where you're looking at probably an average of 5%. We're yet again seeing above inflation increases coming through. And I think as you were referring to Michael a few seconds ago, I think Michael's right. I think that it must be seen in the context of the fact that we do have an election coming up in the not too distant future.
And this is a great worry. I mean, you know, when we look at you know, the view of 7.5% increase that has been agreed upon by government, and NEHAWU being one of the trade unions that refused to sign, Denosa, Popcrew and SAPU saying they are discontent because government has again reneged on what was agreed on when they had to stop their strike. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, yes, I think, you know, if you look at this whole deal, I think, Leanne, I think many of us would say, you know what, when it comes to nurses, policemen and women and firefighters, we should be paying them a decent wage. Some might argue you could make it 107.5% and it wouldn't be enough for the work that they do. And I think there'd be some truth in that, because the reality is that the public sector challenge as far as wages are concerned, in my opinion, lies not at the bottom end, so-called, but at the higher end, where top managers in the public sector in South Africa earn about 9 times the per capita GDP in OECD countries, when in fact in OECD countries themselves, they earn less than 6 times the GDP per capita. So our senior managers, our top managers in the public sector, for me, is where the problem lies, because they're highly, highly overpaid.
Yeah, and that's where the problem comes in. I mean, when we look at sort of, for instance, if we look at nurses, with this increase, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're looking at about 35,000 rand a month. That is what your nurses would get before taxes. And with the new offer, they're going to get about 2,600 rand more, and that's that 1,000 rand bonus that'll come with it. You know, it's quite difficult when you see that, you know, some of these top-end CEOs, government officials, the millions upon millions that they're earning. I mean, I'm just using a nurse as an example, because this obviously goes way across the public sector, and a lot of these public servants who work tirelessly in hospitals, police stations, schools, you name it, it is quite a difficult pill to swallow.
Absolutely right. And you've used a great example, you know, 35,000 rand a month for the nurses and the conditions in which they work. They're very often understaffed. They're very often under-resourced. They work massive hours for this 35,000 rand a month, which is not great. You know, as you say, it goes to 37, 38 now with the increase. But the problem, as you also identified, lies in the fact that the top management within the public sector earn vast amount of money in comparison to their colleagues around the world, almost. And in my view, as far as remuneration policy is concerned, I think that the public sector and government should be looking more closely at more competitive wages at the lower end. As I say, policemen and women, nurses, etc.
Mm.
and trimming the benefits and salaries, the bloated benefits and salaries of top managers.
Yeah, and this is where we need to speak, because even as it stands right now, so yes, of course, I mean, we've got about 1.2 million public servants. This is what it is. And the wage bill, when we look at the cost of the wage bill, I mean, we're looking now at about over 700 billion rand. This is what it's expected to be this year. I mean, that's about 32% of our spend. The country can't afford this. I mean, in fact, even to handle this increase that has been agreed on, there's talk that they may have to fiddle with emergency reserves in order to pay the public servants. I mean, what are we doing to ourselves as a country by getting ourselves into such debt?
Absolutely right again. If you look at South Africa, Leanne, as the total number of employees in the public sector as a percentage of total employment in the country, we're actually on par with most of the rest of the world. We're on a similar level as Belgium and Israel, around just less than 20% of the employed working for the public sector. The dilemma is in the cost. The dilemma is in the cost, particularly at the top management level. And as you rightly said, in this particular case this year, what we're seeing is governments come out and said, and it's right to say this, that there are going to have to be huge sacrifice when it comes to public expenditure. They're talking about freezing positions. They're talking about not appointing, not filling vacancies. Now, all of that trickles down into delivery and service delivery, which is already an issue. So I'm surprised the government has gone this route. They started quite low in the wage negotiation process. They've enjoyed a relatively lengthy strike and ended up doing this year what they've done for the last 25 years, which is paying basically, or in fact, an above inflation increase every year.
I mean, when we look at some government officials, and let's talk about it. Let's break it down so that people can actually understand. And perhaps, Tony, you'll have that. I mean, I've got a bit of the spend in front of me, but when we keep talking about the discrepancies between, we've given the example of a nurse's monthly salary with the increase, but let's go further up the chain. I mean, when we talk about nurses, policemen, or police officers and teachers, etc., let's go to the top. What are some of the packages we're looking at when we talk about these discrepancies?
Well, yeah, without talking specifics, they run into the millions. They run into the millions when it comes to top management. And it's a well-known fact in this country that if you're a top manager, you'd be far better remunerated with greater benefits if you're working in the public sector than you would, most cases, in the private sector, because the benefits are immense. It extends to medical, it extends to transport, it extends to housing. They have exorbitant sick leave allowances as well, for example. So it doesn't take, you don't have to go very high up the job grade ladder to start to see annual remuneration in excess of the R1 million bracket per annum, and that doesn't take long. And in many cases, multiple R1 million remuneration in the multiples of millions of rands per annum.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at just a couple of them, and this was looking at last year, and I think this may put it in perspective, because when you look at the anger that unions speak about all the time, is that the payment and the money goes to perhaps, not perhaps, goes to the wrong people, and it's not shared. I mean, we look at Andre de Ruyter. Before he left, he was on a package of 7.1 million rand per annum. Then there's Edward Kisvatter. Edward Kisvatter is earning 6.1 million rand a year. Even our CEO here at the SABC is earning 5.7 million rand per year. And the list goes on and on and on. I mean, Golile George, I think they're saying he's at 5.8 million rand a year. And at a whopping 9.3, who is that? That looks like it's Makosini Msibi, 9.3 million rand. I mean, these are I'm just taking from a picture that I'm looking at. The Daily Maverick did an article on it, and when they showed how much top government officials are earning, and this all comes from the same purse. And then you look at where the fight and argument comes in. I know we can't afford the increase, but who really deserves this money?
That's right. And, you can go on and on with that list. I mean, there are so many commissions in this country where commissioners in certain commissions earn multiples of millions of rand per annum. And, even if you were just to shave 10% off those higher end salaries, you could probably add 20, 30% at the lower end and reduce the inequality that you are highlighting. So there just doesn't seem to be a desire to do that, and there are lots of reasons. We could all speculate as to why, but I think one has to have some sympathy with organised labour when they make the argument of inequality and when they make this comparison between the lesser earners and top managers, especially in the public sector.
Yeah, obviously we know it's an election year next year, and this is obviously a very key aspect of the negotiations. But one of the things, and I mean, we've put it all in perspective, the great big salaries to the small salaries and public servants and how much they earn. But giving in, and this is where I bring Michael Bagraim again into this, a labour lawyer and former Chamber of Commerce business leader, saying that South Africa could face an economic collapse if government bows to this pressure that's been exerted on by trade unions. What is your comment on this? Is there truth to this? Do you feel that could in fact happen?
Look, I'm not an economist, number one. And number two, Michael does have some political interests of his own in terms of his history, although a good labour lawyer. I personally don't believe so. As a non-economist, I'm not so sure we're going to see collapse, but there's certainly fear and there's certainly anxiety generally when it comes to the public finances. So I can understand why Michael might make a comment like that. I've always felt that South Africa often takes itself to the brink and manages to pull itself back. So I don't have such a gloomy vision of how this might end up.
Yeah, in a very important answer that you gave there with regard to some of those comments that are being thrown around. Just finally, before I let you go, I mean, the wage bill is admittedly the biggest government expenditure, which we've spoken about 32% of expenditure. But it's not the only cost that the government has been cautioned against. I mean, National Treasury has also extended the 350 Rand grant, despite them being on record saying that it is prudent to not extend this because expenditure is too high and there are no funds. What do you say to government about this? Your advice to government on all this expenditure?
Well, if you take the social grant, Leanne, I mean, again, that's something that should be increased. It probably should be at least doubled, as far as I'm concerned, and taken and funded elsewhere from other savings that could and should be made. I understand you've got to be careful in terms of a kind of social security system developing that you can't afford. But the reality of those that are the recipients is what it is, and the 300 odd Rand that they get is hardly going to feed one person, let alone a family. So again, for me, it's similar to the wages that we pay our more junior public servants. We should be paying more, and we should be able to fund this from the savings that come from the bloated remuneration that we see elsewhere within the public sector and the wasteful expenditure that we see elsewhere in the public sector.
All right, Tony, we leave it there. Thank you. Thanks very, very much for talking to us here on the program about such an important issue and just talking about that 7.5% public sector wage increase and the payoffs and disparities between some of the public servants and what they earn. And that's where we'll leave it. Thanks very, very much. National Treasury warning that the wage agreement between government and trade unions will come at an additional 37.4 billion Rand to the public purse and warns that this will come at a cost of future jobs for the country.